Good. It is already afternoon, so good afternoon. Let me just get this going first. I actually probably could do this in German, but I think it would be worse for you than it would be for me. My passive German is okay-ish, so I could follow everything I just heard, but my active German is definitely more than just a little rusty. I'll start with a quick introduction of Trustweaver, more to just give you some context of who I am, and then you can put what I say in context as well, than to make any specific marketing presentation of the company, because that's not the purpose of this presentation here. But let me first make sure to have this installed here. Okay. So Trustweaver is a Swedish company, as you just heard. I am not Swedish, however. This is maybe an interesting introduction to the company as such. I have a passport from the Netherlands and from France. I live in Belgium. My office is in Stockholm. And I could actually carry on for a little while like that. We're a very international company to be based 2,000 kilometers to the north from here, or probably a little more actually, maybe even around 3. If you walked into our office in Stockholm, you'd see that probably about half of the staff that is there actually originates from many different countries in the world. Our mission is very international. Company was started out some 10 to 12 years ago, basically with a number of legal and information security experts coming together around a vision which was all about making sure that compliance and information compliance could be embedded into business processes, as we saw multinationals struggling with the way in which legal requirements were starting to evolve into really quite unmanageable matrices. Today we support more than 50 countries. We work primarily through partners, and obviously SupplyOn is a major partner to us, where we supply, as has been mentioned before, a service which I would characterize as a compliance service. We ensure compliance for invoices and associated documents that get sent to us. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that works. But the prime purpose for me here is to give you an introduction to electronic invoicing as it is evolving in the world from a regulatory perspective. And I have to start with a disclaimer. I'm a lawyer, so I have to start with a disclaimer. That's what lawyers do. We have worked with so many governments and tax administrations over the past 10 years that obviously we start to see the world a little bit through their eyes. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for people in our role, because it is also partly our responsibility, I feel, to sensitize the business community to how tax administrations perceive your processes and your documents and the auditability of documents. So I'll try to share some of that insight with you. First of all, well, we've seen enough flowcharts, I think, in the course of this morning, so I will skip this. This is part of what I call my American slide set, which basically talks about what is value-added tax, because Americans actually don't know that. And that's a major problem in this world, because obviously a lot of multinational companies have a focus, or at least a strong market, if they're not originally headquarters in the US. So a lot of American corporate people really need education on what value-added tax is in order to be able to support processes abroad. That is a process that actually takes some time. So I will skip this slide because you know what value-added tax is. I'm pretty convinced of that. One thing you probably don't know, and this is where the government angle to all of this starts and where it gets very important. Value-added tax is what experts call a self-assessment tax. That's a beautifully politically correct term for basically a wonderful idea that governments had. I think it was actually a German that invented it, and it was refined by a Frenchman. So yeah, you can guarantee this is one nasty tax. It's basically a very clever way for tax administrations to put the burden of tax collection on enterprises. They use the mechanism of the law to get enterprises, companies, to serve as tax collectors. Right? So a large part of the enforcement of and the collection of tax is done right inside the heart of your business process. as opposed to the tax administration having to come and collect it. You have to volunteer certain data and also pay a lot of money into the tax administration on the basis of your processes, and that's of course where the invoicing process becomes really key. Why is the invoicing process so important for tax administrations? Countries that have value-added tax, and this is most of the developed world, a lot of the emerging economies, and growing number of countries in the world use value-added tax as one of the major sources of income. It's usually about a third to half of their income that comes from value-added tax. Most of these countries, whereas they're very happy with this mechanism because it's a very good tax, as I said, it's a very low-cost tax for countries to implement, there's one thing they're really unhappy with, and that is the fact that there is this thing called the VAT gap. If they do their calculations as to how much money they should be collecting through VAT, consistently they fall 20 to 30% short when they look at how much they actually collect. Right? Now, I'll just throw out a number for Germany. What's the VAT gap in Germany? How much money do you think the government should be collecting that isn't collecting in VAT? It's 27 billion euros per year. Right? So the average VAT gap in Germany fluctuates between 10 and 15%, right, of what actually should be collected. It's a huge, humongous amount of money. Right? In the European Union, it's actually around 200 billion euros. Worldwide, we're talking about €500 billion of this beautiful tax that actually isn't being collected. And this is a macroeconomic subject close to the highest priority of many countries. Which, of course, if you bring it back to the modest little invoice that we're talking about here, gives you a bit of perspective of anything politicians might tell you about how they are liberalizing electronic invoicing. You have to put that into perspective. The invoice is the main, and will always be, the main audit and control platform for governments to collect VAT. And the only thing governments want right now, and they have some pretty good reasons for it, is to close this VAT gap. This is the big battle that is going on, and it's a worldwide battle, and it leads to this picture. There are two main systems in the world. Dr. Treskat has already talked about it a little bit, but from our perspective, you can essentially classify countries into three categories. The dark gray ones here are what we call post-audit countries. Post-audit countries, basically like Europe, have said, you can now start doing electronic invoicing, also using electronic tax originals, and just keep doing what you did before. Supplier creates an invoice, buyer receives it, validates it, both parties store it, and in the next decade, we might come around and audit it. Right? That is the post-audit process, because the audit, the emphasis of the audit is when the invoice is already archived and potentially up to a decade later. Right? This is a system that has created this VAT gap of 20 to 30% because that is one horrible system. It's based on how paper used to work, and people have just translated it into the electronic world, saying, oh, let's just go keep doing the same thing. Frankly, it's not a very smart way of going about it. Most of the emerging economies in this world, therefore, started looking at what Europe has produced. After 10 years, we're at 20% electronic invoicing. The VAT gap hasn't been reduced, and there's still a massive amount of confusion in the market about all of this. Not such a wonderful track record, right? So what have Brazil and Mexico and Russia and China and many other countries done? They said, we're going to completely re-engineer the process, and what we want is your invoice data before you even issue it to your trading partner. We will authorize it for you on an invoice-by-invoice level, and we want that control right up front. So they've shifted the control from up to 10 years later to all the way before you even issue the invoice. Big revolution. Now, if you, most of you, I think, are still young enough to see that here, if you're not colorblind, that is, there's a little country in Europe that's actually already orange, and that's Portugal. Right? I can guarantee you, if I'm here 5 years from now, a large part of the Mediterranean part of Europe will also be orange. Why? Because the VAT gap in Italy, just to give you an example, hovers around 30%. Right? And I'm not even talking about Greece. So there is no way that these countries can actually afford to not take an example from Latin America, Russia, and many of these other economies. If you compare this just briefly with what you've seen happening in the last couple of years in Germany, where things have become more liberal, the trend in the world, the vast majority of countries, is for regulation to become a lot tougher, right? So just try to balance those a little bit. Okay, two major systems in the world. This slide has one simple message. If you remove that layer and you start to look, there are as many e-invoicing systems, as many e-invoicing regulatory packages in the world as there are countries, and in some cases as there are provinces, and in certain cases as there are cities. Right? So no two countries have the same e-invoicing rules. Believe me, we are a Swedish company. You guys, I'm sure, have a lot of experience with tax in Germany. Right? We live under the same VAT directive created by the same people with exactly the same language transposed into the same VAT law in European member states. In Italy, in France, in Spain. That does not at all mean the same thing as in Sweden, as in Germany. Right? This is one system living under one set of rules with huge differences from country to country. Still today, despite decade and a half of harmonization efforts. So there are as many countries as there are systems, there are as many regulatory packages, but then if you look at the amount of regulation, you will see that if you look at the main clearance countries, Brazil, Russia, Turkey, and others, you'll see that really regulation is very, very extensive, very, very prescriptive in those countries. One thing that I'm not going to highlight here is also that some of these countries in just a few years have gone from 0 e-invoicing to over 90% e-invoicing, because not only do they regulate it on a cookbook level, they also impose it. You must by 1st July next year use electronic invoicing, or else basically you'll go out of business, right? So e-invoicing grows very fast on the basis of very specific rules in these countries. Europe, compared to Brazil, for instance, is a fairly manageable set of rules, but as I said, don't be mistaken, there are still many differences. But just to give you a bit of a sense of the amount of regulation, the types of topics that are regulated in many of these countries. I'm not going to go through all the detail here. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick crash course in our view of the difference between post-audit countries and clearance countries, just to give you some perspective. In post-audit countries, things work, as I said, the way they always have. Supplier creates an invoice, sends it to the buyer verifies it. Each party stores an original invoice, which is a bit of a strange concept if you start to really get philosophical about it in the electronic world. What is an original invoice? But that original invoice, according to the law, serves the same purpose as a paper invoice in your binder. It is there to prove what's in your accounting system. What's in your accounting system is not your invoice. What's in your accounting system is invoice data. It's a record that needs to be verifiable on the basis of an invoice that you can demonstrate is real and unchanged. That's two different things. It's not one and the same. Just be aware. Right? Okay, so that's how post-audit systems have always worked. This is still the model we use for electronic invoicing in post-audit systems as well. I will give you a little snapshot of our reality. It may also be your reality. People start to think, how this is all very easy for tax administrations. If I trust myself, why shouldn't they trust me? I love that one. Tax administrations don't work that way, by the way. Tax auditors are individuals with limited means. They don't have that much time to sit around, and a tax auditor is somebody who, if you make his life easier, he will make your life easier. If you don't, the opposite will happen. This is a story of an invoice that's legally issued in Luxembourg, technically issued on a platform in the US. It's legally received under a VAT number in South Africa, but it's actually technically received in a shared service center in Romania, and it's physically archived in Spain. Is that an exaggeration? Absolutely not. In the world of multinational enterprises, this is pretty normal day-to-day practice. Now, if you are this poor tax auditor in Coimbra, Portugal, and you come in 6, 7, 10 years later and ask these people, can I see this invoice, and can you tell me the story of this invoice, and can you prove to me that I can actually rely on this invoice as being valid evidence of what's in your accounting system? That is not an easy task, right? So before I talk about how you make invoices compliant, I just want to put you in the shoes of this tax auditor. In that period of time, the organization has changed completely. right? Nobody can really recount that story from 6, 7, 10 years ago, what happened to that invoice. The processes in that company will have changed completely, the systems will have changed completely, and of course the law will have changed a number of times as well. Good luck, Mr. Auditor, trying to access that invoice, look at it, and then determine, do your job, because that's what you need to do, close that VAT gap, actually make sure that within a reasonable period of time, you can walk away and guarantee to your boss, the finance minister, that this was a proper invoice. Not an easy thing to do, right? A little bit of philosophy here. Again, we're talking about post-audit systems, right? We're talking about systems that have functional legislation. It tells you an objective that should be achieved. It doesn't tell you necessarily how to do it. There's something that is incredibly simple and that a lot of companies don't get, including also tax managers. An invoice cannot prove itself. An invoice is defined legally by its content, supplier name, tax amount, all those other good things that we're all familiar with. If you have those things, and if you have it in a system that you trust and you trust yourself, that does not mean, actually it cannot mean, that you have proper evidence of that invoice. You need something else physically to prove that that is a proper invoice. That's just how logic works. Don't forget that. So we've heard the different options in the European Union. The something else, if you use audit trails as evidence, is a number of business documents that will map onto your ERP audit trail that are original and reliable and will together add up to evidence of integrity and authenticity of your invoice. Also very important to know, in Europe still the objective is not that you can prove a transaction. I know that, I mean, that seems to be something that certainly in Germany goes around. If you can just prove a transaction, you're good. No, there is an article, the only article on invoicing that talks about this kind of stuff, and the directive says you must prove the integrity and authenticity of your invoice. One way in which you can do that is to use business controls based audit trails. Right? But that is the aim to do that. The reason why you can use business controls-based audit trails is to prove the integrity and authenticity of invoices, because an auditor doesn't even, there's no point in looking at an invoice and examining its content until you know that's actually a reliable invoice. So that's actually the purpose of the legislation in Europe, don't forget that. So the thing you're going to prove the invoice content with is documentation mapped onto your ERP audit trail that proves that every mandatory field in your invoice is real and unchanged. That's what the legislation says, right? There's another option, is to use signatures. Obviously, you could say I'm biased. Actually, I'm not. I don't really care about signatures. I just know that signatures have one benefit that no other option in the legislation in Europe or other post-audit countries have, and that is that by law, you get a reversal of the burden of proof, which means, theoretically, this is in the law, tax administration has to prove that your invoice is not real and unchanged, as opposed to you having to prove the opposite. Right? This is something that a lot of people don't talk about, but it's of course a major advantage. By law, you can lean back and say, here's my invoice, has a qualified signature on it, now you go disprove it. Very different position from being at the other side of the table. I'm not going to talk about this slide here. I think, actually I will say one thing. There are standards that are fully interoperable worldwide, and don't try to understand the detail of this slide because there's no time for that. It's not very interesting either. There are standards that are used by all serious organizations that use electronic signatures that basically make the validity time of the certificate irrelevant. A long-term verifiable signature can be used to prove the integrity and authenticity of an invoice pretty much until the end of time. Right? So people who say, well, signatures are actually quite a nice idea, but when the certificate expires, I don't have evidence anymore. That is completely nonsensical. We've had already technologies in place, completely interoperable, based on global standards that help you overcome that particular disadvantage of signatures. We also talked about the EDI option previously. Again, an EDI option doesn't mean that you have something in your archive that is the invoice and then you're good. It means you have something in your archive called the invoice, which is the data, proven by a number of other elements that prove that you actually implemented the EDI compliance option correctly. All of this revolves in Europe around the use of an interchange agreement. That interchange agreement needs to contain language that you've agreed with your business partner about how each of you will be maintaining integrity and authenticity through time. If anything changes, you need to have a change management system in place to update that agreement, make sure you have that evidence, historically speaking. I'm going to rush through this. How do clearance systems work? I've told you before, if you're a supplier, it's a completely different thing. Before you can issue the invoice, you need to send it to the tax administration or an agent of the tax administration, depending on where you are. You request clearance of the data set. That data set has to be in a prescribed XML format with a supplier signature, almost in all cases, right? By the way, these XML schemas, they're cooked up in little rooms by tax administrations with very little input from business. So of course, they differ from country to country, from region to region, from city to city even, depending on where you are in these countries. It's a pretty heavy job. This is the simplest clearance schema available. Request clearance, government or agent says okay, then you can issue the invoice, you do the normal process. Very often, in most cases, the buyer then has to do the reverse. Send it back to the agent or the tax administration, say, did you actually clear this? Is this a compliant invoice? Answer comes back, clearance okay, then the basic cycle is over. Now, this is already pretty complex. It puts a lot of things in its head compared to what we're used to in Europe. I could show you slides, they're not in this deck, about how some countries have created variations on this theme. There are many. There are many which can impact your logistics processes, and they can impact the way you do B2B. So, you know, this is in certain cases, the clearance process is beginning to look like a government-orchestrated parallel procurement universe that you have to interact with while you're doing your business thing, right? So this is a pretty serious development, which, as I mentioned, is also going to come to Europe. It's pretty much inevitable. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do together with SupplyOn and what that value proposition looks like. I've told you about the different requirements per country. We have a fairly large team of global e-invoicing experts sitting in our office in Stockholm. They work in turn with PricewaterhouseCoopers and a number of other global networks to make sure that actually we understand how laws evolve. If you do the math, you will see that there's about 65 e-invoicing requirements that you need to keep track of per country, but on average. The average change per country in those 65 requirements is 2. That is a big, complex matrix to get a hold on, to understand, right? And then, of course, in your system, if you want to implement that in your B2B, in your procurement system, you need to go full cycle all the time. You need to monitor legislation, interpret it. You need to then adjust your systems and your processes to the extent necessary, test it, deploy it, audit it, and just keep going. Right? If this is over a large number of countries, this is a very, very expensive, very frustrating thing to do. Believe me, we do it, and it is no fun. So what do we do?
Let me make a question.
Yes, please.
Now we have to state in international business, we have a legal requirement on the 65 here on this exercise on the supplier side. The buyer has different requirements for the same document. What's the reason for that? What's your experience?
The 65 is taken over the full invoicing cycle. So all the requirements for the supplier, all the requirements for the buyer.
That's really good. But what is the rating if the requirements and both sides of the business partners different? It's one document.
Yeah, that can be very problematic. This is not an exact science, unfortunately. I mean, there are so many of these kinds of smart questions that I can't answer. We use a thing we call a compliance map, which is basically a very structured summary of all of those requirements per country: supplier, issue an invoice, archive an invoice; buyer, issue an invoice, archive an invoice, and take it line by line and say what we do and how we interpret that. And then we do some crazy math, which is what happens if you issue an invoice as a supplier under the laws of Turkey and you receive it as a buyer under the laws of Singapore. There is no answer to that, just so that you know. There is an answer to that. I mean, and that is, we try to figure it out, right? And we try to figure it out and put it in the compliance map to the extent that that is actually possible. Right. One thing that I want to say, because there's always this discussion about form and signatures or not, or business processes or whatever. We use signatures, and I'm not embarrassed about that for a number of reasons. One, our customers require us to guarantee a result. Only way you can guarantee a result, also in Europe, is by using qualified electronic signatures, period. All of the other options are nice and good, and they can work really well for you if you have what it takes, but there's no way anyone can guarantee that when a tax auditor walks through the door, you will have a yes, and that you will get it quickly. The only way you can actually do that, in my experience, is to use qualified electronic signatures, because it has the benefit that I talked about. Secondly, we use qualified electronic signatures and signatures as a base process. Again, not because we're religious about that, who cares, it's just a technology, nobody should even have to talk about it, but it is also the basis of every single country's requirements outside of the European Union. The EDI option, the business process controls option, do not exist outside of the European Union. We have to support requirements all around the world. Electronic signatures are the common denominator pretty much all around the world. So if you ask us to guarantee an invoice in issuing or receiving it, we will use qualified electronic signatures per country. And we do crazy things, like if the SupplyOn process sends us an invoice that says, by country code, this is a Romanian invoice that goes to, let me pick a country I haven't picked on yet, Mexico, it's just an example, we will usually do everything that's needed to make it a compliant invoice under both countries' laws. Because, again, going to your question, there is no conflict of laws, applicable law kind of resolution to a lot of these tax issues. Countries keep trying to expand their tax jurisdiction, come up with all kinds of rules. It conflicts all over the place. The only way you can actually deal with this is usually by implementing the requirements for both, which is crazy, which is expensive, but that's what we have to do in order to guarantee a result. When we receive an invoice from the SupplyOn system that says, please issue this in compliance with this law or these laws, we will apply signature and timestamps, and we will often also, in the back end before returning it, if this is an invoice under in a clearance jurisdiction, we will make sure that it gets cleared. We will deal with a lot of other things in the back end, interacting with mandatory third parties and tax administrations, and send it back. What comes back is a guaranteed compliant invoice for that particular set of countries. It can then also, of course, optionally be archived. These are completely separate modules in the interaction. Remember, all of this is orchestrated, or the basis of this in terms of documentation is this compliance map that I talked about, which says precisely what the rules are in each of these instances. So if you say Romania to Mexico, it says these are the rules for Romania, how we interpret them based on the research we do. This is what we do for this country. So you can also historically, 5 years ago, you can check what we did in that particular set of circumstances. So the compliance map not only is the basis for our configuration of the system, it's also our end customers and their trading partners' tax documentation. You can use it in order to demonstrate to a tax auditor what it is you did at that point to be absolutely certain that you comply. In the archive, as a background job, we have any kind of process running for additional timestamps or other requirements that need to be met in relation specifically to archiving invoices. That's of course also documented in this compliance map. Likewise, if you send us an invoice through the SupplyOn service saying this is an invoice that we received either from a supplier in the network or from an external supplier, we will do a compliance validation. We talked about signature verification first. We will do signature verification, we'll timestamp verification, we'll send it to a clearance platform and send it back either with an okay or not okay and guarantee the result of that. Likewise, afterwards, we can also archive it for the buyer. Which leads to this little summary in terms of the value proposition that we are together putting towards the market. First of all, you can instantly go paperless internationally without having to understand all these laws. And you get a result that we actually ensure. You can get quick audits based on local evidence. Why is that important? We don't just think compliance is something that you read on the primary law. The primary law, as I mentioned, is the same in Italy and Sweden. It says the same thing. It means something completely different in practice. So you need to actually understand what the local auditor will be looking for in order to quickly get it over with, right? So quick audits based on local evidence, way beyond just headline compliance. We do maintain compliance over time. If there are changes, we will make those changes in time. We will notify you, we'll make sure that those changes are there when they need to be there. It's fully automated, it's an extremely high performance SLA. We do this for millions of companies worldwide. It has this tax documentation that I mentioned baked into the system, so you don't have to necessarily maintain the core of that yourself. It works across, so it gives you legal certainty across a good number of countries, not only for yourself, but also for your trading partners if they're included in the system, which is very important because trading partners you have very little control over. Are they small, are they large, do they have good processes? How sophisticated are they in terms of the types of documents they can exchange with you? You know, what's their error rate? How do you can apply this process across all of your trading partners, regardless of their size, regardless of their country of origin. And then of course, you're also welcome through the SupplyOn to tap into our very, very large expert database and people who know everything about electronic invoicing compliance worldwide, which can be very handy in case of even your internal rollouts, because we all know that when you start rolling out a service, your first concern may not be the tax administration, may be your local tax manager or your local country manager. Local country managers are obviously convinced there's no way that a centralized solution can meet their requirements. And you need to be able to prove that. We can help you with that. Right? If there is a tax audit, obviously we can help you with that as well. That was the end of my little presentation.